Andy, for setting this up, and thank you everyone for being on the call. I really appreciate your time and how busy you are, and hopefully this is going to be of some benefit. So just really quickly, Compass is a UK-based a kind of ideas and campaigning organisation that believes in something that we call the Good Society, which is one which is much more equal, democratic and sustainable. And we work on what that vision is for the Good Society, but increasingly we work on not just the issues of desirability, but feasibility. How do you actually get to a good society, which has got us focusing more and more on issues of democracy, participation, transformation, and theories of change. And I was doing a project for Barry when he was running the Web Trust here in the UK about a world without poverty. We were looking at kind of some of the framing and arguments around the poverty debate. But increasingly, we got to a position where the issue wasn't just what we want, but how we got there. And that was the genesis for this kind of 45-degree change publication and thought, which since we published it in early on in the year, has begun to kind of trickle out and percolate in different sectors. Here in the UK, people in education have picked up on it, people in adult social care have picked up on it, certainly people in kind of local communities and local authorities have picked up on it. But it's also kind of beginning to get a bit of an international interest as well. I've been to Australia, I've been to Berlin. There's a kind of growing interest in the concept and the idea. I mean, possibly because for the one time in my life, I've stumbled on something which is, quite instantly kind of understandable. 45-degree change, the meeting point of emerging horizontal practice and the relationship with the vertical state. And that in that diagonal 45-degree line, that's what we describe as the fault line of a new society. That was you coughing, Barry, because it just came up on the screen. Anyway, so let me just take you back just quickly through what that means and how and what the thought process is. So the idea is that there's something big going on in our societies, in our technology, in our culture. Society goes through different phases of how it decides things and does things. And in the last 100 years, we've had a chunk of period driven mostly things are driven by technology. We've gone through this kind of what we describe as a machine age, clunky, top-down, mechanical, Fordist. Everyone's done what they're told and everyone's a cog in the wheel, machine age and cogs. You then get the kind of market age and consumers. We decide things and do things not as cogs in machines, but as consumers in a free market. And those things have their place in the world, but it's only a limited place because actually they don't allow us to be fully functioning, free human beings with a sense of agency and purpose, and allow us to exercise all of our attributes and all of the kind of characteristics of being a fully functioning human being. So people struggle to find different ways of coming together, collaborating and making things happen. And what's particularly interesting about the moment is that it's kind of fueled by technology, that the technology itself is neutral, the fact that everyone is connected, everyone is networked, everyone can speak to everybody else, everyone can organize at a flick of a button, that we can have this webinar across the globe with a dozen people and share ideas. That can be done for progressive purposes and it can be done for regressive right-wing purposes. But the technology is allowing a flourishing of emerging practice, thought, action, and organization on an unprecedented scale. And so it seems to us, the question is, how does the state, locally and nationally, operate to accelerate, aggregate, and develop all of that kind of emerging energy, sense of participation, desire to solve environmental, social, civil society kind of issues, which we think is happening on an unprecedented scale, because at the moment it's happening despite the system and not because of it. So how do we have a new relationship between state and civil society, with the state in service to this emerging participatory, collaborative, purposeful energy and action? What sort of leadership does that require on both sides of that line? Because it isn't just about the state adapting itself. It's also about civil society leaders recognizing that you're not going to get greater equality. You're not going to deal with climate change. You're not going to deal with injustice. You're not going to deal with civil liberties unless you deal with everything and work across the piece with lots of different people. If we stay in our silos, we're in trouble. If we work out how we join everything up and act in a political way, politics with a small p, and how do we build a relationship with the state and get the state to help us with the resources, with the legislation, with the rhetoric that can help bring together, I think, quite amazing kind of new practices, new ideas about collaboration, cooperation, and participation. So the 45-degree line is just the space on which that can happen. It doesn't mean that kind of good change is inevitable. It has to be struggled for and fought for, as I say, because the technology can be used for the far right just as it can be used for progressives. But I think that the point of optimism for me, Barry, and I'll finish, is the fact that the network society that we're emerging into has at least the potential to offer a more egalitarian and democratic future. The old ways of imposing change on people, well-meaning change from above, was never going to liberate people. You know, we have to create the good society ourselves. It can't be done for us, otherwise it's a cage. And in a network society where we can all talk, we can all act, we can all think, we can all join up, we can know everything across the globe, it gives an opportunity, if we get the politics and the ownership of the technology right, and if we change our behaviors to be bigger, then I think it gives quite a remarkable opportunity to have a future that we want, rather than a future that, you know, is going to be imposed on us. We talk about a future that's negotiated, not imposed. So I think it's an incredible moment to be progressive and to hope and to have a hope in a better future, despite everything. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you very much, Neil. Can I turn now to Masha and tell us a bit about you, Masha, your situation, and briefly, how does this resonate with you and you're in that situation?
Yes, hello. My name is Masha Chertok. I'm a director of CAF Russia, which is a Russian foundation and part of the CAF Global Alliance. And we've been working for 26 years now, developing the culture of giving in Russia and strengthening communities, particularly on the kind of community philanthropy side of things, and working to grow community foundations. And now it's quite a sizable movement in Russia of 70 plus organizations, both in big cities and also in very small rural towns and even villages. So I have read the report from Compass before when I was preparing for this webinar, and I was also heard Barry talk about this 45-degree change idea at a recent event in Moscow, where we invited him. And it does resonate a lot, and kind of reminds me of another concept which I really like, and it's the concept of new power, which was developed by Henry Timms and Jeremy Hamans in their book, which is called New Power. And it also talks about this change that technology brings into relations between people and how it fuels this horizontal movements. And they also talk about old power, which is kind of the institutions side of the slide which we're looking at now. So it's kind of it seems that these ideas are kind of emerging in different places from different people, just because they're very timely ideas and they reflect the situation we all experience in some way or another. And I live in Russia, which is a very top-down society, and it's probably in a way more stable because of that, because all the main decisions are made through a vertical kind of chain of power, and people historically has always felt pretty disempowered and without any real mechanisms to actually influence how decisions are made, even on the local level, let alone the federal level. We see a lot of what Neil has been talking about, that the best intentions, when they're translated through the vertical, kind of go both ways. They never lead to the kind of good consequences, because it's just not possible to make change like that, the change that people would want to see. And it also reminds me of a quote which I saw at an exhibition recently of Banksy, who basically one of his pieces says, there is nothing more dangerous than someone who wants to make the world a better place. And I think the kind of the key thing is that it's someone. So it's kind of one person who makes the world a better place for everyone, because that's probably not possible at all. What in terms of kind of critique of this 45-degree change, which I really like, is that I don't think it's just society and government relations, because we see many different kinds of institutions which are kind of built on this new old power idea and kind of vertically made, and they have the influence which they can use to kind of create change without listening to people. And the first idea which comes into mind, because I work in the foundation sector, is foundations. Many foundations behave like this type of institutions, and they really have resources to kind of inflict change on communities and society at large. And we see a lot of pushback, for example, in the US now, on kind of the elitist nature of foundations that are kind of not touched by any democratic decision-making processes, and still they can affect a lot of change. But there are probably others, like, companies that kind of have a lot of influence and a lot of power, and they multinational companies, somebody is actually writing this note right now, multinational companies are extremely powerful. Yes, so I think we should look at this 45-degree change idea kind of even in a broader context, and see how we can work with this other vertically integrated stakeholders if we want to achieve change which really people want, not just those extremely powerful agents. So yeah, I think that's probably all I wanted to say for now, and I hope there will be a lively discussion after me.
Thank you so much, Masha. I'm going to go down the list. We've heard from Neil. We've heard a response from Masha. Now it's your turn, and I'm relying on the pain of participants. And if I miss anybody, can you please raise your hand? If you click on the participants button, you can see that there's an option to raise your hand. And I'm just going to go down the list. Barbara, just in a minute or so, who are you? Where are you? What do you do? And does this 45-degree change idea resonate with you in your context?
Okay, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm pressing my nose towards the screen. My. Okay. I'm working for the Zambian Governance Foundation for Civil Society, and I'm based in Zambia. I'm Austrian by nationality, and we were a donor-funded civil society support organization, and we are trying to move to transform into a locally embedded, locally based community foundation, which is a very radical shift from where we have come from. Now, second question, I wanted to, what I resonate a lot, the 45-degree, yes, I've heard this before, and I found it a very interesting concept. But I wanted to add on to what Masha's, what just my previous, the Russian lady just mentioned about our inability, or the important fact that private sector plays a very important role. I totally agree. I've been at the summit recently where we discussed how to combat the fossil industry and how we can interact with these players like the oil industry. And how can we make them understand that climate change is a very important issue? So I think here in Zambia, and that's what I realized, that we have a limited ability as local NGOs or as civil society organizations to interact with the private sector. And I see, what I see here in Zambia and globally is that the corporate sector is going amok. I think there's tendencies towards deregulation, and this is supported by politicians, by narcissistic politicians like everywhere in the world. And I think this is one of the biggest dangers, that the corporate sector is taking over and government is becoming less powerful. And we are the local civil society organizations are not so much used to work with the private sector, including here in Zambia. There are no rules, there's no frameworks. And I think this is one of the biggest struggles. How do we grapple with finding a collaboration framework agreement with the corporate sector, because they have become so powerful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The vertical axis is actually, as Neil's diagram shows, it's institutions. Government is a key part of that, but it's not just government, it's the private sector. And as Masha said, many other kinds of institutions too. I'm next going to turn to Cleo. Who are you, Cleo? Where are you? What do you do? Very briefly, and does this resonate with you in your situation? Are you there, Cleo?
Sorry, yeah. My name is Cleo, and I'm the director of programs for an indigenous activist fund in Eastern Africa that works with LGBTIQ and sex workers through resourcing, grant making and capacity support, as well as convening and research. Indeed, as a participatory fund and with a shrinking space in East Africa, we are currently seeing the importance of working across the silos. But as our previous speaker has just said, I think the thing that lacks, the work that needs to be done in that work is to develop framework that allows for us to work across those silos due to the different politics that the different sectors do have. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cleo. Now turning to Serbia and going to Galina. Tell us who you are, what do you do, and does this resonate with you? Does this framework work for you?
Hi everyone, this is Galina from Reconstruction Women's Fund from Belgrade. We fund grassroots women's initiatives and non-formal groups, and my position is community coordinator, which means I'm in charge of visibility and local philanthropy. I see this 45 degrees change as a necessity in our society, but at the same time, I see it as a challenge that we are not able to meet at the moment on a systemic level. But what I see as a point of optimism is that we can target perhaps individuals who are in the vertical part of the diagram, who can perhaps pave our way to a more systemic change. Thank you.
Thank you, Galina. That's very helpful. HP, who are you and where are you, and what's your full name, and what does this resonate with you?
All right. Yeah, can you hear me, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my name is Jonathan Kifunda from Tanzania. HP is just which I conduct. I work with an organization, a local-based organization called the Thubutu Africa Initiatives. It's based in Tanzania in rural areas, in an area called Shinyanga. We work with different partners to address issues related to gender-based violence for girls and women, and we collaborate with the government to do that. But yeah, personally, I think this is an ideal framework for us because it brings different stakeholders in place, and together we collaborate to make sure that whatever we address with the same effort. And being a local-based organization where we think the power has to go, then I think we are placed in a better place for this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you much, Jonathan. Jenny, who are you, and where are you, and what does this mean to you? Does it resonate?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Barry. This is Jenny Hodgson. I'm with the Global Fund for Community Foundations here in South Africa. So we are, we've really, the 45-degree change sort of framework, I think, as well as things like New Power, as Masha had mentioned, I think have really helped explain from the kind of the resourcing of civil society, so philanthropy, development, civil society space. I think it helps explain a number of the blockages that we kind of battle with structurally, in that this sort of, we know things should be bottom up and, you know, small is beautiful and all this, but however the system at the moment delivers in a way that it can only really engage with things that look like itself. So although civil society is below the 45-degree line, you know, on this, actually often the danger is that funding, a top-down way of working, can only see and engage things that cross over to be on its side. And I think this idea of actually we need people working intentionally, consciously at the 45-degree line to create the pathways between the two has become quite a sort of helpful sort of a visual, a metaphor for how we think about this work and the upcoming symposium.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Imarione, who are you? Where are you? What do you do? And does it work for you? Does the 45 degrees resonate in your situation?
Sure. This is Lexi Marone from Humanity United with my colleague Elise Ford. We joined a few minutes late, so apologies to have missed some of the introduction. I think this is a really interesting framework, similarly have been influenced by the analysis of New Power, though personally I've had a hard time understanding how the description of institutions as they are today helps us understand what that means for how to create change. So I think this is an interesting translation in a way of that, or a way to kind of reframe that concept and looking at the structure of institutions and the structure of civil society to understand kind of what that means for how to push change forward rather than just understand how it's already happening.
Thank you, Lexi. Yeah. That's really helpful.
This is Elise here, and perhaps to provide a bit of background on the organization that we work for. So we both work for a US-based foundation called Humanity United. It's part of the Omidyar Group, so a set of foundations that were established by Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay. We're the kind of human rights wing of that set of foundations. And unlike others on this call, feel like we're undergoing a process of quite radical transformation, or trying to undergo a radical transformation of how we show up in the spaces that we engage in. Lexi and I are both part of our peace building team, and the last 5-6 years has been very much a journey from an organization that kind of had quite a top-down international approach to supporting change to one that's much more embedded in communities, much more grounded in participation, networked approaches. I'm very much aware of, as a funder the power imbalances that our presences could create, and thinking creatively about the ways in which we show up to really empower the communities that are at heart of social change processes. I think personally, in terms of the 45-degree framework, it does very much resonate. I think a lot of our thinking, while it's in the peace building space, has really been centered around trying to reimagine the development paradigm in a way that could seize the opportunities of a more networked approach, and how that more networked approach would allow the shift in power that we think we need to see. I think like Masha, I feel that what's underlying this is not necessarily, there is a distinction between institutions and civil society, and that nexus may be the key to positive change. But I do feel that there's an underlying sort of project management or management mindset that leads to that sort of hierarchical thinking. And I think that that's exposed in the New Power book that a number of people have referenced. I'm actually, we're sat in the Gambia right now. I'm based out of Dakar, and I think one of the challenges or questions that comes to mind for me, and certainly did in reading the New Power book, is the sense that institutions will recognize and see that it is in their own interests, or it will be a necessary survival strategy to change and to accept this 45-degree change. I think the challenge that I hold is, certainly if you look at state structures, I don't think that's the history of how states have changed and reformed. I think we need to expect a lot of stasis within the system, certainly by those who hold most power. The development paradigm is still quite resistant to this sort of thinking, and so I think it'll be really interesting to explore how do we create the conditions for that change. But yeah, super fascinating. Thanks very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Alyssa. That's great. Mariana, who are you and where are you? What do you do, and does it resonate?
Hi, my name is Mariana from Comunalia, which is the Alliance of Community Foundations in Mexico. I'm right now in Sao Paulo, that's why I'm in these hours connected. And we strengthen community foundations, we connect them to tools and opportunities. And also we do advocacy at the national level. And this framework resonates a lot with the situation we are living right now, with a very harsh relationship with the government. And I've been thinking also if at the national or at the local level will be the same in the application of this framework. I'm not sure of it. And yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Mariana. Rachel.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So my name's Rachel Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Global Giving based in the UK, and I'm part of our global executive team leading on what we call evidence and learning. And I'm actually here with my London team. So Claire, Zdravka, Ashish and Ellie. So bringing in a force of people to listen in and think about 45-degree change. So thank you again for convening. So Global Giving is an organisation started about 16, 17 years ago now, that actually wanted to harness technology to try and democratise the aid and philanthropy system. The idea being that technology would be able to create more direct links between community groups, small NGOs, those that don't have big brands, for example, to funding both very small individual giving, so now called crowdfunding, and also up to some of these bigger institutional groups that were looking for more direct giving opportunities. And I think some of the points that have been raised so far are really interesting to us, and certainly the framework is of interest to think about how it does apply and resonate with the model that Global Giving has. I guess listening to it, I definitely am struck by the fact that looking at these different groups, there is still such interconnectivity between both the dependencies and the potential for upwards, downwards and horizontal influence, but also a necessity still placed on certain institutions for some of those other groups, perhaps in the civil society side or quadrant of the chart, where it's not just about the fact that there are funding instruments that are more well known, grant making, foundations, etc., but also that the mindsets of some of the organisations that are in that civil society space are still quite stuck in the current or traditional paradigms. And so it will take quite a significant shift in all places, which is why it is a really interesting framework to look at, to encourage changes in both structures and mindsets and practice. So I mean, thinking about it purely from a funding perspective, there are different aspects we might want to think about and want to kind of, you know, work to build a group of forward-thinking funders or institutions that can encourage the groups that are seeking resources to think differently about what the money actually, like what receiving funds actually means. And that to me is around the flexibility of funds, the tolerances around risk and innovation and encouraging that, how who feels that they have the power in spending the money and what the results are and how prescribed or prescriptive that is up front. And also the whole piece around accountability and the kind of what big institutional funding resources come with when you receive those funds, and the accountability expectations that you have, and how that in itself causes these upward sort of accountability senses that organizations have, and potentially distracts from people ultimately, which is really where we should be placing more accountability. So I think it's a really interesting framework. I'm really glad that we're all coming from so many different perspectives on this call, and really excited to see how this framework can continue to guide this thinking and conversation. Thanks, Barry, and thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Rachel. That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. I'm now going to turn to Stephen. Stephen, who are you? Where are you? What do you do? What's your perspective? Does it resonate with you?
Great, thank you, Barry. Can you hear? Yeah, am I heard? Good, good. Great, my name's Stephen Pittam. I have been in the philanthropy world for a long time. I'm now currently on the board of the Global Fund for Community Foundations. And I also work with the Global Green Grants Fund. Both of which organisations are really keen to think about grassroots and how solutions often lie at the grassroots. And what I really like about the idea of the 45% change is that, you know, in itself that's essential, and we've got to find solutions which give power to local initiatives, but by itself that's not enough. And so this idea of the interrelationship between the vertical and the horizontal I find absolutely fascinating. I do have a problem with the geometry, because I don't know quite what the poles here mean. And it almost looks as if the greater civil society grows, the less the institutions grow. And that might be what we're talking about. It's also a very linear kind of idea of having this line going right up the middle. So whilst I absolutely love the idea of how we work on the meeting line between vertical and horizontal, I'm not absolutely sure that this meets it for me. And the other thing that I really feel is that we have to build in, and I think various people have said it, is the corporate sector and corporate power. Because if I think about where I'm operating in my own town, the local authority in my area has had a third of its budget cut within the last 5 or 6 years, which is all to do with the economic process that's happening in terms of austerity and the kind of neoliberal market. So and the interesting thing is, to some extent, community action at a local level does, it seems to me, need a strong state, strong local state, to be able to react against. At the moment, in a sense, I sometimes think that civil society in a town like I live in is actually stronger than the power of the local state. And when that happens, you can't get the kind of change easily either. So so there's things about the economic power and the corporate power that has changed the world. And one of the things that strikes me is that corporate power has gone global. And I think wherever we are in the world, we would recognize that corporate power's gone global, and yet democracy and all of the institutions of our democracy are still local or national. And somehow we've got to build in some sort of analysis around that, I think, before we can really think about, what the model is for significant change.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's very insightful, as usual. Wale, how about you? Where are you? What do you do? Does this resonate?
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I think it was good to follow Stephen, because I was about, to talk about, the big problems, facing the world, globalization and nationalism running in opposite directions. But first, my name is Wale Oshofiso. I'm the Senior Technical Director for governance programs at the International Rescue Committee. So the IRC is a international humanitarian and post-crisis development organization. We work in 33 countries globally, in Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and Europe as well. And we also resettle refugees in 22 cities in the US. So basically our mission as an organization is to help people whose lives have been shattered by conflict, help them to survive, recover, and gain control of their future. Just on this framework, which I really like, I just want to point out that this is not new. This is not new. I remember 17 years ago when I used to work for UNDP back in my home country in Nigeria. I'm based in the UK now with IRC UK. But 17 years ago, we used to talk about the new governance framework, which looked at institutions, civil society, and private sector. It was actually a triangle that you needed, to work with the three to solve both national problems, local problems, and global problems. But I think we can all agree that the world has significantly changed in the last 17 years. The global challenges we face today, climate change, migration, conflict, violent conflicts, nationalism, and xenophobia. These are global challenges. And I come from a perspective where I actually, think that the challenge, if we're going to tie all these things together, the challenge we face in the world today is a very simple but complex one to solve. How do we reduce inequality, not just within countries, but also between countries? Because if we look at globalization moving at a fast pace, technology, information is easily accessible. That's actually disrupting, a lot of activities within the nation state. So globalization is pulling in one direction, and the effect of that, is the rise of nationalism and xenophobia. Working for an organization that supports refugees and IDPs, up to the 80s, 90s, even early 2000s, the word refugee generated, sympathy in the West. But today, you talk about refugees, people, start thinking about problems, terrorism. It's become, associated with negativity. So I'm not, I like this framework. It talks a lot about the what. If we had some other, like the private sector, multinationals are very powerful, as I said in my text. If we add that somewhere within this framework, that's great. For me, we know the what needs to be done. The challenge is the how. How do we operationalize this? And looking at it, not just from the local level, but also from the global, because those two things are interconnected. The think globally, act locally stuff. Again, it's just rhetorical. We've not been able to figure out the how. How do we actually do this? And tying all this together as well is a question of politics. How do we navigate, politics are simply defined as who gets what, when, and how. How do we, influence that as actually civil society actors? So we know the what, the question is the how, and I hope that, probably this group is going to, figure out the how, and if we do, maybe as a group we could win a Nobel Peace Prize.
Thank you very much, Ole. Yulia from Russia, your Masha's colleague. Have you anything you'd like to add? Whether this resonates with you, or whether it doesn't?
Thank you, Barry. Hi, everyone. Of course, it does resonate with me because we work for the same organization with Masha, so we see similar things. In my position as the director for programs and donor relations at CAF Russia, I am responsible for all our program activities, which fall into three broad areas. One is general development of the culture of giving and philanthropy in the country and the NGO sector. The second is helping, supporting the empowerment of local communities. And the third is improving the quality and accessibility of different kinds of services for different groups in need. So I can see that the 45-degree change concept is very relevant to all three areas of our program activities. Unfortunately, we do not see a lot of activities happening along this diagonal line at 45 degrees because what I mostly see in my work is that those working along the horizontal line, when they want to some changes to happen, they often try to oppose the vertical line or to build themselves into the vertical line. So I think we should be showing more of this 45-degree concept to people so that they would become aware of it and show more successful examples of changes that happened thanks to this diagonal line.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Yulia. That's very insightful of you. Some important points there. I just want to make sure that I've included everyone. There's somebody with a telephone number which starts 44785. Have you spoken? I don't know who you are because
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi, Barry. It's Lucy Gilbert.
Oh, Lucy.
Sorry, I just had to call in on my phone.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm Lucy. I'm from Quartet Community Foundation. Working in Bristol in England, but I'm also a trustee of the South Sinai Foundation, which works with Bedouin communities in Egypt. So just briefly, I find this framework incredibly interesting and useful, thinking about my work in the UK, particularly around a project that I'm currently working on, which is looking at wider transformational change in the city. It's bringing together lots of different actors across and along that axis. And I think this will be a very useful tool for talking to people who might be resistant to this way of thinking. And the idea of the design versus the emergent coming out of the paper I found incredibly useful. Thinking about applying this in our work in Sinai, in Egypt, I struggle a little bit more with it. I think the kind of work that we support with our Bedouin colleagues is very much around this emergent grassroots, new ways of networking, working. It's quite exciting, but it's very small scale and very grassroots work. And it's an environment where the government and all those wider institutions, it's quite a restrictive environment for civil society. And I'm struggling to apply the lessons from the paper or to see how it might be taken forward in that context. So hopefully that's something that we can maybe discuss in future.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Have I missed anyone else? Is there anybody that hasn't spoken at least once that wants to? Right, okay. Let's move on. What I want to do in the last few minutes of this call is I want to go back to Neil and ask him to reflect on what he's heard and where this leads him, because I think one of the things he's likely to say is this is the paper that he wrote. He admits is designed to start a discussion, not to end it. It's not definitive in any way, and a critical thing is how do we take this forward? And then I'll turn finally to Jenny to say, how does this fit with the events going forward with the symposium, and what else, just briefly, what else is going on? Neil, you've got 3 or 4 minutes to respond.
Barry, you're completely wrong. I was absolutely right the first time. I've completely cracked it. There's nothing wrong with my argument. I don't know how you could say. No, of course, this was really early thinking. It's very preliminary. It's very sort of fresh thinking. And thank you so much for all the kind of comments and thoughts. And it just shows you that when we come from different places to discuss the same issue, we bring all of that diversity, which is part of the argument in the piece. It makes us so much better. And Stephen's spotted the flaws in the actual kind of the diagram itself. The axes don't work actually. There's only the horizontal and the vertical would be on one axis. So it doesn't work, but as a concept it works, and at a level of a kind of operating concept it could be powerful. Of course we should put business in there, and we could put businesses in one place and SMEs in another, and there are kind of the 45-degree line isn't fixed. In different sectors, in different countries, in different parts around the world, it wouldn't be 45 degrees, it would be 30 degrees or 80 degrees where the kind of meeting point is. So I think we've got to think more about that, and that's why your kind of feedback was kind of super helpful in all of that. So I mean, just picking up a couple of points really. The really good comments from the people from Humanity United. I mean, I didn't kind of major on this, but this is really about humanism or barbarism. We're either going to reinvent our democratic participatory cultures, structures and practices, or we're going to go to ethno-nationalistic, right-wing populism. So this, and they'll attack democracy first, and then they'll attack civil liberties. So I do see this as a really big kind of moment for, the world going in 2 different ways. I think there are really interesting questions that all of this begs, really about 21st century leadership, and the leadership at the level of civil society, business, and the state. How do we act and do things? How do we get people collaborating? How do we act in a way that is both humble and bold? How to, as the people from Global Giving, Rachel was saying, what's the role critically of funders in all of that, and how do they give people license to experiment around that 45-degree line? So look, I mean, what we want to do is to kind of take the conversation and go back and kind of rethink, not just kind of, in a table or in a room with some research, but learning from different practice locally, nationally, globally, across sectors, and begin to apply this to a kind of next wave of thinking and action, and really keep this kind of thing motoring and developing. So thank you so much, Barry, Jenny, and everyone who's commented. It was fantastic to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Jenny, would you like to sort of tell people a little bit about the symposium and how these conversations leading up to it are being kind of woven together, and what we're trying to do in this kind of participatory approach to developing a kind of new world?
Sure. Thanks, Barry, and thanks, Neil. So I think, as Neil said, this is really like a concept to help us reimagine, reset, give ourselves permission to think differently. And I think I've spoken to variously of you on this call separately, but I think one of the fact that this sort of emerged originally in a slightly troubled UK context, but actually it is really around what is the notion of the good society. What are the societies we want, and what do they need to look like, and what are the roles of different actors in those? And in terms of the sort of international development discourse, which has been largely premised around the flow of money, this really offers a sort of compelling vision which looks at more kind of qualitative questions, but it also kind of opens up to a more kind of universal or global narrative of, community organizing in different parts of the world. How can we do that in ways that are more kind of progressive, pushing forward the kind of change we want, and pushing back against the sort of populist types of community organizing? And the more we can open this up as a kind of global outpouring of energy and innovation, rather than a north-south developing one, I think really as an exciting possibility. As the symposium, you know, the dimension of power has been a critical one in our thinking around how do we shift power wherever it sits, so that the center of gravity is more towards people organizing for themselves, building democratic, inclusive societies and working in different ways, at a time when we know that some of the models that have been used, that were sort of, you know, developed under a paradigm, you know, decades ago, aren't achieving that we're creating monsters, that we are kind of recreating and consolidating centers of power. And so how do we start thinking about the systems, the structures, the governance, the ways of working, so that we can really kind of both see action happening at the most local level, but when necessary, it aggregates as a form of people power. So at the moment, we have lots of different weaving conversations, of which this is one, leading up to this symposium around questions of leadership, which is what Neil mentioned. How do we stop ourselves in the development sector from having to institutionalize everything? How do we better understand what kind of leadership is required and what kind of institutional forms support that? Questions around measurements and metrics. So much of the relational stuff at the horizontal axis, kind of when it shows up on the formal side of the development sector, gets lost. We just see organizations and their capacity to spend our money and report back on it. So how can we really sort of bring a different lens and be a bit more bold and imaginative in our thinking? So yeah, this is just another, I think everybody comes into this question. I think at the moment there's a huge appetite, both on the sort of top-down donor side, large institution side of the system, to do things differently. And we are seeing the emergence of alternative models that are grounded in communities and owned by people, and how we can start to, you know, bring those different pieces together so that they can see each other and start to interact in more meaningful ways. And that the symposium really is the chance to bring people together who are thinking about this wherever they are in the system. So yes, I look forward to seeing those of you who will be in London in November 18th and 19th, and the rest of you, you know, we are all still together in this long and exciting process.
Yes, and we will find ways, even if you're not at the symposium, we will find ways of being together in some kind of space at some time. As I've been listening to this call, as we come to the end of this now, I've been thinking a lot about what ecologists call the edge effect, which is where one kind of thing meets another kind of quite completely different thing. And in a sense, I think that the 45-degree angle of change is a metaphor for that. It's about how people really learn. The ecologists say that when you get a difference meeting together, that's where learning really occurs. And I think it's emblematic of this call. We've got, you know, I just made a list of where people were and what they were doing. And I was really struck that we are so different, and yet we're talking about a language that actually does begin to unite us. And I think that although Neil has pointed out the mathematics of the 45-degree change is a bit wonky, what its value is that it's a heuristic device. It's not it's a model. It's not reality. It's a way of us beginning to connect and thinking about these things differently outside of our normal categories of thought, which have actually brought us to the edge of ruin. So in a sense, I think that the optimism that Neil has conveyed to us today, reflected in Masha's remarks, and you know, it's really striking that such an idea could resonate in so many different cultures. But we need to adapt it, because culture is very important. We can't kind of impose a model on everybody that we all have to follow. But I think if we have this kind of approach as a way of holding conversations, learning from each other, building what Neil in other contexts has called movement generosity, so that we can begin to craft the world we want, rather than leaving it to other people who will almost certainly craft the world we don't want. It's now exactly 11 o'clock. This webinar will be online at some stage, so you'll be able to refer to it. And you know, now that you've taken part in this, we really want you to be part of the kind of movement that takes this forward, because that's essentially what we need. Organized people, organized money, and social change, social transformation to shift the power is what we need. So thank you all for taking part in this. Thank you all for your brilliant contributions. And wherever you are in the world, I hope the rest of the day is as good as the last hour's been. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you, Barry. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Barry, thank you. Bye.